All right, well, so we are a small group here and certainly appreciate everybody coming out. And I will introduce myself and then I'll let you introduce yourselves, and then everybody can introduce everybody else themselves.
There's somebody trying to get in there, Ted. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Well, he's a speaker. I should have done it, right? Yeah.
Hello. Are you here for a seminar?
I think. Just wants to go to the child section. Yeah.
Just for a little while. Okay. Welcome. We were just
God, you go all
about
the
to
way
start,
through
so
the
you haven't
kids'
missed
department.
anything.
So go across the hallway. Oh, that's what she is. Yeah. That's what you gave it.
So we're just getting started. My name's Ted Wimpy, and I'm director of the Fair Housing Project at Champlain Valley Office of Economic Opportunity, which, even though it's a part of a community action agency that serves primarily the northwest part of the state, Chittenden, Franklin, Grand Isle counties, we have 3 housing-related programs that are statewide in outreach, including the Fair Housing Project. There's also Vermont Tenants, and there's a mobile home program. And for the Fair Housing Project, we have a grant from the U.S. Department of HUD. And as a part of that project that we're actually in the last 3 months of it, although we will be looking for other sources of funding to keep something going in the future. We're doing this campaign statewide, Thriving Communities, Building a Inclusive and Vibrant Vermont. And so that's what this is about tonight, is really looking at, and I should say, well, I'm getting into my presentation before we do all of our introductions. So let's back up and we can let you folks say who you are and why you were interested in this. So we'll start with you.
I'll start. So
Okay.
my name is Kiana, and I'm interested in this because I do some work in town with the Charter House Care Coalition, just like the local homeless shelter, and they do food access in town. So I just heard the title, Building a Vibrant Inclusive Vermont, and thought, oh, wow, I haven't heard like a talk like this in town, and definitely have to go. So.
Excellent. Okay.
Hi, I'm Ellie Bacon. I'm the AmeriCorps Vista member at the Community Engagement Office at Middlebury College. So I've worked with some of our students that are here. And my role at the college is to work with student organizations and community partners who are working towards poverty alleviation. So I work with Charter House and other groups. So I'm interested for those reasons. And I'm new to Vermont, and so I'm interested in these issues, how with housing in general. So.
Excellent.
My name is Dan. I'm Middlebury student, and I also am interested in this because I do some work at the John Graham Shelter, and just interested in how these, learning more about this and how it can inform the work there.
Okay.
My name is Tiff. I'm also a student. Dan and I are on a council called Community Council, and we're supposed to be looking at staff issues. And one of the things that Dan mentioned is that food insecurity and housing insecurity are big things within the Middlebury College community. And I also saw the word inclusive, so that's good.
I'm Mary Rogers. I'm Rob's wife.
Oh, I know you.
Yeah, hi Ted.
I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. I've aged.
I am, no, it's not that. I'm just really bad. If I haven't seen anybody in 2 months,
It's
I
a
don't
long
recognize.
time.
I'm so embarrassing. Anyway.
But we did have a home for, I don't know how many years, Rob, 15 years? In Burlington, a land trust home that we loved. We moved from a small apartment and had 3 children and brought up. Then we're able to bring up the 3 children in a land trust house. That was wonderful.
Excellent. Well, sorry.
No, it's good. It's good. I have.
I embarrass myself all the time with not recognizing
I just
people.
remember John because of Dia. That's it.
Okay.
I'm Laura Certainly. I'm with the Middlebury Select Board, and I'm interested in affordable housing for our community. And unfortunately, there's another meeting
Oh.
running with this that might be drawing people. So,
Okay.
just so that you know, regarding a transportation project.
Oh,
For which I will
wow.
also need to peel off. But,
Yeah, yeah.
But I'll get what I can.
Yeah.
And as you know, we're looking at an economic development initiative behind the Ilsley Library.
Right.
As you know,
Jan
is on-
Demers.
was on that
Yeah.
committee. That committee is finished with vetting.
Right.
But we are not finished with the discussion. As you
Okay.
know, affordable, how do we need to report affordable housing in Middlebury? And we know it's urgently needed.
Excellent. Well, welcome. And Tim?
Oh, I'm Tim Johnson. I work with Ted as part of the Fair Housing Project in Burlington.
Yeah. And I should say, I'm continuously bragging about Tim's writing. He was a journalist for many years before he started working with us, and writes very, very well. And he writes a blog on our Thriving Communities website, which will, at the end of my slides that are just introductory, and there's 10 or 12 of them, but at the last slide, there is a web address for the Thriving Communities site, and there's almost every working day Tim will do a new blog. So check that out, and you can subscribe and get email updates as the new blogs come out. And John and Julie will introduce them as we move forward with the presentation. They are co-presenters with me. So here we are. So what is a strong, resilient community anyway? And this definition is one that we could all come up with, definitions for what we think of as a strong, resilient community. This one I lifted from the Vermont Department of Housing and Community Development website. I've seen variations on the same definition many places, but I like this. It's succinct but encompasses a lot of things we're looking at and thinking about. An urban, suburban, or rural community that has more housing and transportation choices, is closer to jobs, shops, or schools, is more energy independent, and helps protect clean air and water for all citizens. So that definition, I think, embraces what we're presenting and what we will be discussing here. There will be an opportunity for Q&A, and also please feel free to interrupt with questions or comments at any time as we move along. So one of the things we're going to do, and you'll see, is we look at not just the why do people have to affirmatively further fair housing if they receive federal money, and we'll get into that very brief detail, but we're trying to look at the positive benefits of doing the things that in effect affirmatively further fair housing. And so it's very timely because just a few months ago, HUD released a newly defined rule. Ever since the 1968 Fair Housing Act was passed, the Federal Fair Housing Act was first passed in 1968, there's a clause in there that says that the enforcing agency of the federal government, that being HUD, will take steps to, I'll completely paraphrase, it may actually be here, but they will take steps that will help to mitigate or undo some of the problems that have been a part of this country's history, unfortunately, of segregation and discrimination in housing and concentrations of poverty and race and class, which we're still struggling with today. But it says that there will be steps taken. And so what it really means, practically speaking, is for HUD, how is HUD going to do this? Well, HUD has leverage in that there are various programs, federal money that HUD has control over, and for those municipalities or agencies or other entities that receive federal money, they're supposed to be taking these steps at affirmatively further fair housing. And the HUD rule makes it clearer. You'll find as we move along that there isn't one way to do this, and HUD's not going to come knocking on the door of any given town unless they are flagrantly violating fair housing law. But there's various ways that municipalities and entities can get at increasing housing opportunity for people in protected classes under fair housing law. And so who should really know about affirmatively furthering fair housing? Really every entity that receives federal money, and we like to say every entity, because the steps we're talking about taking are good steps for communities to take, not only because it creates opportunities for people in protected classes and lower income people in general, but it also helps the town itself or the city or the municipality itself by creating, and you'll see examples of this, better business climate, more opportunities for working families that need affordable housing, all the things that make the towns and cities vibrant. So, like I say, we feel like affirmatively furthering fair housing and doing the things we're going to be talking about here today is just good business, makes good business sense for towns. One of the things, the state of Vermont has extremely low vacancy rate. It's both in terms of rental housing, and it's also there aren't that many opportunities for first-time home buyers to be able to afford housing. That's the reason land trusts are so important, and John will talk a lot about land trust models. So, what are some of the ways that affirmatively furthering fair housing helps towns? It creates customers for businesses. It creates, as I said, workforce housing. It makes it so that transportation can be more efficient. All those things we'll get into. So affirmatively furthering fair housing we think of as the stick part, as the rule, but really we're particularly interested here in talking about the carrots and why it's a good thing for municipalities. So this is concluding my part. If you have something to write on and you're interested, the Thriving Communities, www.thrivingcommuniesvt.org is the website, or if you want to email me, rtimfhp@cvoeo.org. All right, so Julie, for some reason yeah, that's right, John is next. I thought John was next.
All right, well, good evening. I'm John Davis. In Burlington, there are 12 guys named John Davis, so I'm the one with the very funny middle name that is added to the John Davis to distinguish me from all those other John Davises. I work with city governments and with county governments and with a lot of nonprofits around the United States to try to help develop housing policies that promote the sorts of housing, the sort of inclusive communities that we're going to be talking about tonight. I'm going to focus on housing but we should acknowledge right up front that vibrant, inclusive communities need more than just housing, right? You need strong downtowns, you need jobs with livable wages, you need transportation plans, food security, services, good infrastructure. And there's a certain complementarity, synergy between affordable housing and all of those elements, and Julie's going to talk about that a lot more in a moment. I'm going to focus on housing and furthering fair housing. And as Ted said, most of our policies, most of our initiatives and interventions in the United States around fair housing have been focused on the negative side, right? Where we've tried to remove discriminatory barriers in lending, in marketing, in renting, in the way we invest public money, in the way we zone our cities, to try to remove those barriers. That's sort of on the negative side. But this strange phrase, furthering fair housing, has another alliterative adjective or adverb that goes with it, because it's affirmatively furthering fair housing, which means that we need a balance between preventing discrimination and promoting housing options that make it more accessible, more affordable, easier for a diverse population to move in to a community. And we're going to focus mostly tonight on the positive side, the multiplying the options, expanding the options, because so much of the literature, so much of the work that other people do around fair housing is on the negative side. So we're going to try to do a little more of a balance here. Now, if you're trying to expand housing options to develop vibrant, inclusive communities, I think there's a cluster of interventions that any community has to consider: design, tenure, and price. And in the kind of Venn diagrams of my youth that they used to teach in elementary school, these features overlap. And the most effective interventions, the most effective strategies for affirmatively furthering fair housing, I believe, are actually to be found at the intersection of these three. Julie's going to focus more on the design aspect, so I'm going to talk about the more boring side of it, which is tenure and price. And how do we multiply options for affordable housing in communities like Middlebury, like Burlington, like Montpelier, by focusing on the way that housing is owned and operated, tenure, or the way housing is priced. In the United States generally, for generations, our housing policies have been trapped in the box of a number of either-or dichotomies, simplistic either-or dichotomies, around the way that housing is owned, around the way that housing is operated. So we've sort of been stuck in this box, this either-or choice. To draw an analogy with another sector here in Vermont, because we live in Vermont, we're fortunate enough to live here, I'm going to draw an analogy with agriculture. Because in agriculture, in Vermont, for generations, if you earned your living in agriculture, essentially you were either working with cows in dairy, or you're working in forest. You were harvesting timber, or you were sugaring, right? You either worked with cows, you worked with trees. That model of agriculture worked okay until about the 1990s, when people working in this sector realized that the only way to sustain their operations was to innovate and diversify. So instead of just cows versus trees, farmers said, we need a new business model. Similar thing has happened, particularly in Vermont, around affordable housing, where we've taken those traditional dichotomies and we've broken them apart, and we've innovated and we've diversified. On the ownership side, we've taken the sticks in the bundle of rights, and we've untied the ribbon, and we've reallocated those sticks in different ways. So instead of the owner of property holding all of the rights, responsibilities, risk, and rewards, we take those basic elements of ownership of property and we have allocated it among multiple parties. On the operational side of this, we've said, you know, we can't just be investing in affordable housing. We need some party to stand behind the deal to make sure that that publicly assisted affordable housing remains affordable, one owner after another, one renter after another. It remains in good repair. It doesn't go into foreclosure. So sometimes in this area, this diversification, we refer to that as the three faces of stewardship. You need somebody standing behind the deal. And when you start unpacking ownership, unpacking the operation of housing in new ways, you come up with new models of tenure. I mentioned the Community Land Trust a little earlier when we were introducing ourselves, but there's a whole array of these new models that diversify the whole way that housing is owned and operated. We've also diversified our whole approach to the type and design of housing. No longer is affordable housing, whether in the United States as a whole or here in Vermont, what we think of as drab, ugly, cookie cutter, right? There's new attention to design elements. Every one of these pictures on the screen is an example of affordable housing, subsidized housing, low-income housing, all of those negative adjectives that we used to attach to housing that was affordable to a broad array of the population. I happen to choose some pictures of affordable housing, subsidized housing from outside of Vermont, but we're also doing some very nice design work inside Vermont as well. So when we start thinking about the way that housing is designed, we're thinking about size and location, energy conservation, new attention to accessibility, to life cycle housing, so that as you age in place, you can still get in and out of your buildings. Yeah? Now, all of these elements, though, have an impact on the other side, which is price. So let me jump over to price. I just say a few things about that, and then I'm going to turn it over to Julie. On the price side, communities have been trapped in a dichotomy of their own. Most housing policy in the United States at every level of government has been built around these two legs of the stool. Either we have subsidized housing on the production side, or we've tried to make it affordable on the consumption side. On the production side, whole array of public interventions, where we've tried to expand the supply of housing that's nicely designed, that's accessible, but in terms of price is affordable so that low-income people, moderate-income people, working people can get into the housing. On the consumption side, we've tried to remove financial barriers, educational barriers, discriminatory barriers that would keep people from getting into that housing that we've produced. Now, as long as local economies looked like this and behaved like this kind of model of production or consumption worked okay, right? But that's not the way the housing market works and housing values work in most communities. It looks more like this. And when the housing economy looks like that, and it follows the business cycle up and down, the kind of housing that we're trying to create that's affordable for low and moderate income people, and the populations themselves are particularly vulnerable at the peak and the valley of the business cycle. If everything was nice and even, less of a problem. But at the peaks, what happens is when housing markets are really hot, you lose affordability. When they're really cold, you have a lot of deferred maintenance. And when they're hot or cold, you have the creative financial people coming up with all kinds of new ways to finance. And you end up with the kind of foreclosure crisis that we had from the Great Recession in 2008. Even when the economy is pretty good, you boost low-income people into home ownership, and about half the time they succeed and half the time they fail. That is, 5 years later, if you go back and you've helped boost a low-income person into homeownership for the first time, and you go back and you ask, is that person still a homeowner? The national data shows that about half the time they're still a homeowner, half the time they've gone back into the rental market. And all this data that I've got up there, or the studies that I'm citing, this came before the Great Recession. This is when times were pretty good. So most of our housing policies in the United States have kind of been a leaky bucket, right? We pour the money in, we create the affordability, we create the initial homeownership opportunities, and within a short time, it all leaks out. This is a pretty dumb way to do affordable housing, but this is the way we've done it in the United States for generations, except in Vermont, where we have a couple of statewide agencies and a number of public officials at all levels of government that have been uniquely far-sighted and have plugged the hole in the bucket. And they have said, if we're going to pour public money into creating affordable housing, whether it's rental or home ownership, we've got to make sure that we keep it for a long period of time. And I don't know whether it's because of Yankee frugality, where you only want to invest in something one time, or whether it's just the unique Vermont culture, but we have a set of policies and priorities at our statewide level and at the local level that says if you're going to invest scarce public dollars in creating affordable housing, let's keep that housing affordable, one renter after another, one homeowner after another. It's pretty unusual as you go around the United States. And here are the three faces of stewardship. Again, where our policies in Vermont are really designed around these three P's: preserve, promote, and prevent foreclosures, security of tenure. This doesn't happen by itself. You can't just create this housing and say, well, all right, we've got these new models of tenure, we're going to keep it affordable forever. There's got to be somebody standing behind the deal. So the other thing we've created in Vermont is a network of nonprofit and public sector entities that stand behind the deal after we've created the affordable housing to make sure that it's not lost within a few years. So I think we've done a pretty good job in Vermont at trying to find that sweet spot, that intersection of design and tenure and price. I'll mention before I sit down one place where I think that we haven't yet done much interesting, innovative thinking, and that's around what is known as the silver tsunami. We have a lot of old people who are kind of hitting our housing market, staying in our housing market, and we haven't quite figured out what to do about that. The lines, the horizontal lines there I put on there, that's where we are right now. But look in the next 10 years, 20 years, and 30 years, what happens to the population 65 to 79, 80 and over. That's what's known as the silver tsunami. And the interesting thing about that population is what a large proportion of that elderly population in the United States and in Vermont owns their own homes. So, and this is, I've just got to put a red line there, 65 to 79, that very high percentage, over 80% of that particular demographic are homeowners. On the other side of the demographic are young people trying to get in to affordable housing. So you've got an interesting dynamic going on in our communities where you've got elderly homeowners who are, I won't say stuck in their housing, but they're in the housing, and some of them would like to get out of it, or they like to figure out how to stay in the housing and age in place at the same time that you've got a younger demographic who's completely locked out of the market. So I think an interesting challenge for us in Vermont is going to be to try to think about what happens to that stock of elderly owner-occupied housing in the next 10 years, and how we try to navigate, broker that transition from the elders who are holding homes today and the young families who are trying to get in to the homes in the next few years. All right, that's my quick overview of the diversification of agriculture and housing in Vermont. Julie?
Thanks, John. I love to follow John because he prevents all of the questions that I can't answer. His talk gives so much more information than I'm able to talk about in terms of price and tenure. I'm Julie Campoli, and for the sake of the young folks in the audience today, I was in your position about 35 years ago, had come to town and was interested in the area and trying to figure it all out. And after I graduated, I went away for a while and came back. And I've been working with, got a degree in landscape architecture, and I've been working with communities in the state to try to plan for more compact growth that respects the historic settlement pattern of the state. And in planning for growth and trying to fight sprawl, the one thing I came to realize is that in order to find an alternative to sprawl, you need to live closer together. And that is quite a challenge. And I'm going to talk about that a bit more. So I've done a lot of research into settlement patterns and the issue of density and how to create cities, towns, neighborhoods that are more walkable. So I'm going to talk about one key ingredient for inclusive and vibrant communities. And this is the thing that makes housing much more affordable, and it puts opportunity within reach of the greatest range of people. And that's dense, walkable, urban form. And yes, I'm going to talk about urban, even though this is the state of Vermont. And I'm going to explain why being urban is so important for rural states like Vermont and how it's really necessary for our future. And it really comes down to choice. And that's offering people from all walks of life and very different income levels a home and a neighborhood that suits their particular needs. This is the kind of housing we built for the past 50 years, and this offers very little choice. There's one type of house, single family home, and it's suitable for one type of family, which is large. And whole neighborhoods were arranged in this way, which made only one type of transportation possible. Now, the 21st century has brought us many changes, and this one-size-fits-all approach is going to fall very short of meeting our needs. And this is basically how John left us with the silver tsunami. This is a just different way to think about it, that we're just getting too old for sprawl. There's a lot more of us over 65, and by 2050 there's going to be twice as many senior citizens. And in Vermont, that means about a quarter of the population, and we're going to have about 91,000 more people over the age of 65. So that means that they're going to reach the point where cleaning out the gutters, painting the house, mowing the lawn is going to become much more burdensome, and the home ownership is going to lose a lot of its charms. People are going to look for alternative that better suit their needs. And one is living in a place where they have the conveniences of urban life, and most importantly, they have other transportation options to fall back on if it comes to the point where they cannot drive a car. And those are apartments near downtowns that offer things like transit and destinations that are close to walking. And then there's this other generation at the other end, the kids that spent a good chunk of their childhood strapped into a car seat, hours and hours getting chauffeured around by their parents. They have now grown up, and many prefer riding in elevators. They're not necessarily looking for the big house out in the country on a large lot or in a suburb. They pretty much, if you look at the surveys that have been done by many people polling this millennial generation, finding that they pretty much expect to live in an apartment, and they prefer walkable places. And unlike previous generations, they don't have a problem with public transit. So they're not really interested in driving, and it's interesting to see that their car ownership rates are sinking. They're making the car companies rather nervous because they're wondering who their future buyers are going to be. Millennials tend to be drawn to places where they can get around without a car. And they're often sharing living quarters so they can afford neighborhoods that have a lot of urban amenities. And this is the latest piece of evidence. This morning on NPR Morning Edition, there was a story about how in Des Moines, millennials are buying houses in much greater, at a much higher rate than they were a couple years ago. And at least in that market where housing is much more affordable, nationwide, it seems that despite student loans, millennials have better credit, partly because they're not taking out car loans, but they're also better with credit card debt. And so they're starting to find that they can start to afford houses. And there's been a run on home buying in a place like Des Moines. And this is one of the key quotes from that story, is that it's really important to not just offer good jobs if you want to attract millennials, but make sure that there's a lot of affordable housing in that mix. And if you want to coax 20-somethings, 30-somethings to your community, it's really important that you have to develop housing near city center, because that is what this market is looking for, people of that age. And it's interesting and important in the state of Vermont because we are a graying population. The northern New England states have a population that's getting oldest fastest of any of the states in the country. And across the country, households are getting much smaller. So that means a very different kind of housing is going to be important in the coming years. Housing that's suitable for single households and households without children. So the realtor surveys are showing us that there's been a shift from the past, that people still want single family homes, but they're fine with a smaller one, and what they would like is to live in a place that's much closer to the places they have to go every day. The neighborhood is becoming more important than having a large house and a large yard. And location matters because people are sick and tired of driving. Every trip, every day is made in the car, and all the pleasure has been drained out of the experience of moving. And we're driving not because we want to, but we're driving because we have to. And this is a far cry from that romantic notion of the automobile that was sold to all of us in the 1950s as something that was going to be more glamorous and make life more pleasant and more easy. And with our dispersed settlement pattern in Vermont, we're driving even more than most Americans are. We drive 7 billion miles a year, and that's an average of 14,000 per driver. So just set aside the environmental impacts of all of this driving, and let's think about how this affects family budgets, because we're here to talk about inclusive communities. Just like John's charts of housing markets going up and down, it's not just always a sunny day scenario. Right now we're in a period of cheap gas, but if you've lived very long, or if you don't even have to live that long to see the ups and downs of it, it's down right now, and it's going to be going up soon. You can count on that. Americans spend anywhere from $1,000 to $4,000 a year for gas. And right now it's at a lower point. But then you have to include the cost of the car, which is not quite so volatile. That's kind of steadily expensive. Anywhere from $7,000 to $11,000, depending on the kind of car you drive. And it's perhaps because we don't pay the cost of driving all at once. We're doing it incrementally by the day and by the week. When we write the check for the car insurance, when we renew our registration, when we buy gas, it's all these little amounts. Or perhaps it's because we're so conditioned to believe that driving is like breathing. It's just something that you do and something that you have to do. We kind of absorb those costs, and we're not aware of all the money that we're spending on those thousands of dollars every year, thousands of miles every year. So for a typical Vermont family, and that's with the median income of $52,000 a year, the biggest expenditure is for transportation. So when you add in all the other things that you actually have to spend money on, there's not a whole lot left for discretionary spending or for savings. And this is the median income. Half the population makes less than that, and a good deal of Vermonters are below the poverty level, and that cost of transportation is making a huge bite out of their income. So the cost of traveling around is something that we become aware of when the price of gas goes up. The rest of us become aware of it, and we look for alternative ways to get around. But when we have a sprawling settlement pattern, it's very difficult to do that, and no one understands it better than the people that can't afford cars, and they have to get to work. Their workplace is not near their home, and they have to traverse across a hostile landscape to get there. In 2008, when gas prices went up the last time, and then followed by a recession, this double hit on expenses sent a lot of Vermonters onto whatever available transit, whatever transit was available to them. And they were doing it in much greater numbers than they ever have. There's a 73% increase in those years. And the interesting thing is that ridership has continued even after the recession has kind of has waned, despite lower gas prices. And this is an indication that Vermonters are looking for something different. And that when they're presented with options like a commuter bus that can get them to work from Heinsberg to Burlington or from Middlebury to Burlington, people take those options. So demographic and market trends are telling us that we want different sizes of houses, we want different shapes of houses, we want different prices of houses, and we want them to be in convenient locations. And so this affordable housing project in Bennington that's located 4 blocks from downtown is a really good example of what is going to be highly sought after if it isn't already. But we don't have enough places like this in existence in the state to fill the need for this. There might be some on the drawing board. I suspect there are not any, it's not nearly the amount that we're going to need to satisfy the requirements of an inclusive, vibrant community. And while we've done a really good job of preserving our downtowns and villages, they don't necessarily have the things that we need every day, like groceries and jobs and schools. A lot of those activities have been relegated out to the edge of town outside of a walkable distance. So creating an inclusive, vibrant Vermont is going to be, as both of the previous speakers have said, is going to involve much more than just building some affordable housing units. It requires balancing housing and transportation and providing access to jobs and services and creating opportunity, especially for people of low income. So walkable urban places, this is like the same list of benefits that Ted was talking about with resilient communities. If you build a community in a compact, integrated, mixed-use way, you get all of these benefits. There's been study after study after study, each one focused on a different one of those issues that again reinforces the fact that walkable urban places create better health, better water quality, and for the purposes of tonight, housing and transportation equity. Here's the catch. Density is required. You need to have people living close together if you want to achieve any of those benefits. And the problem is that we seem to have a cultural aversion to density. If you're a developer of affordable housing, if you're a community, or if you're a community developer, or if you're a town planner, you probably know that if you bring up the word density, you're going to see some faces like that, and you're going to hear people scream, and it's going to get kind of uncomfortable. And the problem is that when planners hear the word density, or they think of the word density, or they say the word density, they're thinking of downtown Middlebury or Bennington or some of our just wonderful examples of traditional settlement. But unfortunately, when other people hear the word, most of the rest of the country hears the word density. This is the image that they conjure in their mind. It's something very negative. It's an example of a failed housing experiment from the 1960s. Or else they think about something like this, what I call dense sprawl, which is just a kind of monotonous array of uniform housing without any kind of other amenity there. This is actually not that dense, but it looks dense. It looks awful because of the design of it. So it's really important to distinguish between these two words, density and crowding. People often hear density, but they think crowding, or use these terms interchangeably. But it's important to define them differently. Density is really a mathematical ratio. It's just the number of people in a given space. Number of housing units per acre, number of people per square mile. It's just a fraction. Crowding is more emotional. That's the subjective perception that that number is way too high. And a good example of crowding is when you have a neighborhood. This is a good example of South Central Los Angeles, where you have a lot of people living in this district of Los Angeles, but not that many housing units. So that means a lot of people are crammed into fewer housing units. So that would be called overcrowding, but it's not necessarily high density. So getting that balance of housing units and people is really key. About 10 years ago, aerial photographer Alex McLean and I put together a catalog of images showing what different densities look at different levels of neighborhoods all across the country. And it became the book Visualizing Density. And the point to it was to dispel some of the myths that we carry around about density, and to bring some visual information to the conversations that we have about density, so that we're all conjuring up the same images when we're having conversations about what density is. So we showed different neighborhoods at the same density level to show that 23 units an acre on Capitol Hill in Washington looks a lot different than a neighborhood in Staten Island. Even though that density number is exactly the same, living in those two places would be a very different experience. People have positive reactions to one and not the other. And it doesn't have to do with the number, it has to do with the way the streets are laid out, the way the buildings are designed, how much greenery is there. And another example, this is St. Johnsbury, Vermont, and a neighborhood in suburban New Jersey. Exact same density, but very different living environment. We went around the country, we had workshops, really small towns, really large cities, in every region of the country, and we worked on this issue of density. We did design plans, and we showed people images of neighborhoods that have housing at the exact same density, or a very narrow range of density. And we said, okay, which ones do you like, which ones do you not like? And tell us why you like the ones you like and why you hate the ones you hate. And what we came up with, and it was amazingly consistent around the country, was a set of characteristics that people uniformly associated with bad density, the stuff they didn't like. And that's that it was monotonous. It was cut off. There was way too much paving. It looked like it belonged to cars more than it belonged to people. Not many trees, and it didn't look like it was going to last very long. Like it was going to just look, it was going to kind of fall apart and not have a sense of timelessness. And here's an example of a slide that people uniformly disliked. And then, more importantly, these are the words that people kept using and associate with good density. Lots and lots of trees, variety. You could walk from your door to somewhere interesting. It was unique. It wasn't like a lot of other places, and that it was going to look as good in 50 years as it does today. And here's an image that consistently rose to the top of people's preferences. So what that long, deep dive into the issue of density taught us is that it's not the number that matters, it's the form that make people love or hate a place. So if you want to add more housing units to a neighborhood or downtown, design is really important, plays a really important role in all of this. You're going to get a lot less opposition if you design it well, and you're going to end up with a better place for people to live. So here are some of the housing types that can be gracefully integrated into Vermont communities. I'm going to show from the lower density range to the higher. First of all, you can offer people a single-family home, but you can do it on a much smaller lot, and this will save a lot of money because land is the biggest cost when you're doing housing development. So you make those lots a lot smaller, you put the houses closer together, and you get this kind of very traditional, dense urban feeling like many, many villages, especially villages in Vermont have. Yet people really have a sense of owning the whole home. And there's a precedent here in worker cottages. This is a really tiny little town in central Vermont, Hancock, where they have they had a lumber mill, and this was the worker housing that was associated with that. Very pleasant little street, very affordable housing. And then if you add a second unit in the back of your lot, at the end of the driveway, this is what we call an accessory dwelling unit. This one is in Randolph. It's a really great way to incrementally add affordable housing to a neighborhood because the people that own the property are gaining the benefit of added income. They're also making it possible for a family member to join them, and it makes people be able to stay in a house that might be a little more a little less expensive because they can rent out that second unit, and it adds to the diversity of housing stock. So if you wanted to live in this neighborhood, if you need a big house, there's a big house. If you need a smaller space, there's a smaller space. So it extends the range of the types of people that can live there. And then of course there's the duplex, which is basically 2 units of housing within one structure. And it could be something like this with an L, where there's an entrance on one part of it, and then an entrance in the other, two sides of the house. Or it can become something more like a traditional duplex where the house is split evenly in half. And the nice thing about duplex is that both families get an outside space, which is really great for families with children. And then you can mix those duplexes and single-family homes along a street, and you've got a higher density, but you have a street that still looks like a traditional neighborhood. So as you increase the density of a place, you're increasing the ability to sustain services. Basically, businesses need customers. Survey after survey of potential buyers and community members, people say, well, I'd love to have a store down the street, a corner store that I can walk to, that I can buy some milk, or I can buy some bread or some beer. And what they're not understanding when they say that is that shop owners are not going to want to locate down the street if they don't have enough customers. So if you want to have a business that survives, you need to have enough people living there. So at a density of 6 units an acre in a neighborhood, that makes it possible to have something like a corner store. It also makes it possible when you get up to 7 to 8 units an acre to have reliable bus service. You can have bus service at lower densities, but it has to be subsidized, and the bus is not going to come very often. You might be lucky if it comes every half hour, but more likely every hour. And bus service that comes every hour is like no bus service at all because it's not very workable. It extends your commute time to unacceptable lengths. So up at that level of 7 to 8 units an acre, then a townhouse is a really perfect way to build that kind of density. And that's where you're attaching single-family homes together so they share a party wall. You still have a front yard, you still have a backyard, you can have balconies, so you can have access to outdoor space. You can have your own front entrance, which is important to people. Yet, because they're closer together, you save land, and also you're saving heating costs or cooling costs because you don't have as many exposed walls. So here's another example of townhouses, some more modern loft style, which is really popular in many places. And then the next step up, 12 to 20 units an acre, is what's called a big house. And that's just a bigger structure with maybe 4 units of housing in it. And it looks very much like many of the old houses that were built in the Victorian era. And these are all ways that you can fit new, denser, affordable housing into an existing neighborhood and not have people get quite so upset at the prospect of new development, because although it is change, it's not it looks much better than other types of housing, so they're more willing to accept it. And here's a renovation of a large house in that Bennington development where they've created more units by dividing it into smaller spaces. And then you get up to 12 units an acre. Then it makes it possible to have not just a corner store that you can just get a few items in, but a whole full-service grocery store that you can buy most of the food that you need for the week. And this is just an amenity that is highly sought after and highly valuable. So upstairs apartments, adding units above retail down below. We have lots of examples of this, and a lot of the nonprofits in Vermont communities build these in their village centers. It provides great convenience for the people that are lucky enough to live upstairs. And then, of course, there's the apartment building that has more units in it, single use, but placed near commercial streets. Also offers that convenience. And a Vermont example. And these are higher densities, up towards the 20 to 50 units an acre, depending on where it's located. So these are all examples of how you can integrate denser development in places, in towns in Vermont. And it all comes back to choices. It's this range of building types that offer the broadest selection of units and prices for the broadest number of people. And it makes it possible for young people to join a community or to stay in the community they grew up in, because there are affordable options there. And it also allows older people to stay as they age and stay in place, because there's much more variety. So location is a really important part of this. It used to be common for us to locate affordable housing in some remote location outside of town where the land was cheaper, and we just really didn't think about how people were going to get back and forth, and that burden of transportation cost was not even discussed. But thankfully, things have changed. So in order to create equity and gain the benefits of density or lower housing costs, they need to be in village centers, near services. So when you locate an affordable housing development in a village center that has services within a walkable area, then you're essentially giving people free transportation. They can get to those places they need to go without using a car. And it makes it possible to build a transit system around those dense clusters, around that downtown. You can just walk to a central location and get on the bus. It makes transit work. So in order to do this kind of development, we need to make some changes in zoning. A lot of our land use regulations do not allow this. There's been some change on this front. An example of that, we need to not just allow denser development, but we need to encourage it. And an example of that is in Portland, Oregon, where they have made it much more simple, much more easy to add an accessory or granny flat unit in the back of your lot. They waived the development fee. A lot of people wanted to do this, and they made it easier, and by making it cheaper and simpler, there's just been a flood of these accessory dwelling units. And the result has been many, many more affordable housing units have become available without any public entity having to go to the expense and the effort to do it. Just kind of the market made it happen. One particular problem we have in the state of Vermont, even though we allow accessory dwelling units, there's a state law allowing them, we got a problem with our lot sizes. Most towns require a pretty large piece of property to build a house on, and that just makes everything more expensive. You can see the number of communities in Chittenden County that require a large lot size, and that's going to prevent this type of dense development. So we need to allow smaller, more affordable parcels. And then parking is a really big piece of this picture. I could actually give a whole lecture on the impact of parking on not just affordable housing or housing costs, but on the vitality of a community. But I'm just going to leave it with these little charts that just shows that when you raise the number of parking spaces that are required per each housing unit, then you're boosting up the cost of housing, and that cost gets passed on to the people that buy the house. Most communities in Vermont require 2 spaces per units, so you can see how that kind of jumps up from 1 to 2. You're really imposing quite a burden on the folks that are developing the housing, and then it gets passed along to the tenants or to the buyers, and it's totally unnecessary. So design is a really another important part of this. If you were to show up at your neighborhood planning assembly with a design for 4 units of housing with 2 in the front and 2 in the back and parking in between, and you showed them this, you probably get screamed out of the room. And if you came with something that looked like this, exact same idea, 2 units of housing in the front, 2 in back, parking in the middle, but you design the buildings differently, you landscape the parking lot, you're going to still probably get some resistance, but there's not going to be as much as if you come up with a good design. You can make new housing that's affordable look like it belongs in a traditional historic neighborhood if you pay attention to what you're seeing and create forms that echo the traditional forms. That was, and this is an example of apartment buildings that do that. And it's often, people make assumptions about what affordable housing looks like, or worker housing looks like. And it's always fun to just, show some images and ask people to guess which of these are market rate and which of these are subsidized affordable. And oftentimes, as John said, it's getting better, and it's increasingly difficult to tell, which are affordable and which are market rate. So when someone says, we don't want that kind of development in our neighborhood, it's really important to point out that that kind of development is increasingly difficult to identify. So I'm going to just close with this phrase: the future is urban. And it's true if you look at numbers of population moving from country to city all over the country and all over the globe. It's interesting to look at this recent study that is trying to get at the idea of what makes a place desirable, what makes a city wonderful. And this particular study looked at how they vote with their pocketbook. Like, what are the qualities of a neighborhood that people are willing to pay more for? And the first one is kind of no surprises, good schools. That's what most people are looking for. And then the second one is also not that surprising, low crime. But the interesting thing was the third, and that was bars and restaurants. And it's kind of curious, like, why that? Are people just drinking a lot more? And the answer is that bars and restaurants locate in places where people go regularly. They're kind of an indicator species. They're going to be near the hardware store and the offices and the places with the services. So if you're looking for a place that has bars and restaurants, then you know that there's probably going to be other things that you can enjoy there. And it's this access to other people and the opportunities and the services that those other people create when they get together. That's the thing that's most desirable. And it's really interesting that people are willing to pay a lot more for that, because we have this images in our head that everyone loves nature and they want to be in the country and they want to have a nice view. And it's actually the man-made features that are appealing in this was the answer to this question of what makes something desirable. And it really tells you that humans are social creatures, and it helps us understand why there have always been cities, and there always will be. So the future is urban, but for Vermont that doesn't mean urban in a big city sense. It doesn't mean New York or Boston. We think of Vermont as a rural state, and in fact 100 years ago it was much more urban. It was also much more rural. It just wasn't suburban. There was a lot more untouched countryside, and the cities, the downtowns and the villages were much more bustling, much more active, much more dense. At a place like Bennington, you'd find a streetcar that connected Bennington. In Manchester, in a place like Bethel in the 1920s, you could buy a much wider array of goods than you ever could in a community that size now. It's really kind of sad to think of what we've lost in our towns and village centers. So this is a dream that 20th century Vermonters had about what living in Vermont is all about. Big house overlooking the field, maybe a nice view of the mountains, and it could very well be a dream for many Vermonters still, but it doesn't need, we don't need any more of this. We have plenty of this type of housing. It's not affordable for the growing number of Vermonters for the 21st century, and it's not going to be suited to our needs. This is a spatial arrangement that's going to serve us much better, and it's going to give us housing and transportation options, and it's going to give us choices. But this is never going to happen until we embrace the kind of attitude that was present when a place like downtown Randolph was created in the 19th century, and that was a place of opportunity. It was dynamic. It was where things changed, and the future was celebrated. And being together and being an urban place was not scary. It was fully embraced. And that's the sort of culture that we need to sort of focus on if we're going to have thriving, inclusive communities that are dense and urban and not afraid at all of changing. If you want more information on either of these topics, you could check out the two books on the website. And I would love to answer any questions with John and Ted that you might have.
So I would like to thank Julie and John, and also say before we open up discussion, if you know people who maybe would enjoy seeing this presentation, either this one that's actually being videoed tonight, which will be made available all over the state on the cable access TV, but we also did a webinar of basically the same presentation a few weeks ago. And if you go to the Thriving Communities site that I gave you or you can Google Thriving Communities Vermont, you'll see we have a Facebook page that may pop up first, but you'll see a website, and there are some links to the webinar and to the slides. We may have made a few changes to the slides as we went along, but at any rate, let's just open it up for discussion if people have any comments or thoughts or questions.
So I'm interested in just maybe hearing a little bit more about, I know that we were talking earlier about how Vermont's done a really good job in making, having good planning, and it's ahead of a lot of different places in the states for having good, affordable communities. But I'm just interested to see what, as far as affordable housing has changed in the last 5 years. I know that there's been some problems with homelessness in the state, with 54% increase in childhood homelessness in the state, and what can be done in the state, affordable housing wise, to make people more secure in that type of housing.
Yeah, that's a good.
Sounds like maybe a good question for John, if we can get him up here again, or you're still wired.
We might want to repeat the question for the video audience.
That would be ideal, but I caught it, but.
You did?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead, John.
He has a wire on there.
I think I still do. You know, the biggest barrier to serving the poorest of the poor is the enormous gap between the cost of housing to produce and the income that they have to be able to get into a secure rental or homeownership situation. The only way to close that gap is with some kind of infusion of public money. And that money is being cut and cut and cut. The current Congress is trying to remove the largest source of equity subsidies that are still available, called the home program. But it's been gradually whittled away for a couple of generations. So you need the subsidy, but on the design side, you also need the density. You know, you've got to figure out a way to reduce the cost of the housing significantly. And the two biggest costs, aside from just the cost of the sticks and the bricks, is the land and the parking, at least in the city, right? So if you can start to address the land problem with greater density, if you can start addressing the parking problem so that so much of your land isn't being devoted to the automobile and instead being made available for people, then you also need the subsidy, but you know, you need a mix of all those things, right? But do you want to add anything to that? I mean, particularly for the poorest of the poor, there are fewer Section 8s. You need the services that are attached to the housing, and the money for that has been going down. So it's a kind of a triple whammy for the poor. The cost of housing goes up, the subsidies go down, the services go down, and it all comes together to create an enormous homeless population.
And I will say that, of course, we're focusing, because we're all living in Vermont now, we're thinking about Vermont and how we can solve problems in Vermont. Obviously, housing, homelessness, affordability of housing is a national problem. It's not just a Vermont problem. I will say that I heard a statistic on Vermont Edition, I believe it was, on Vermont Public Radio recently, and I've heard it before, but it just brought it home again, that Vermont is the 10th most expensive state in terms of living costs. So, you know, a part of the problem is the affordability of the housing, but it's also lower incomes, you know, for the jobs here. You put them both together and you look at some of the zoning and some of the things we've discussed earlier that make it harder to build more affordable housing through the state. And part of the solution is, and a very important one that we have to address nationally as well as in the state, is the getting more money back into from the public sector into addressing housing affordability and homelessness issues. But we also can look at you know, changes to the zoning, as Julie focused a lot on, to make density more easy to do, density done well, as Julie says, and that will create more opportunities for affordability.
Yeah, we have a lot of barriers. You know, removing the negative barriers that John didn't spend as much time with. You know, one of them, as I said, is parking and those land costs, and some of the zoning regulations. We can do a much better job in Vermont of removing those barriers. We've been very slow to allow that kind of density in villages and downtown neighborhoods, despite, you know, good design and more inclusive public processes. There's just a bottom of the line, just a real reluctance to accept change. that might probably just in human nature. So it's just, we have to work a lot harder to break down those barriers. But as John said, you know, even with all the barriers lower, it still costs money to build housing, and people that don't have any money to pay for it, you know, there needs to be more of a public subsidy than there is. Now we need to get back some of the, regain some of the ground we lost in the last 20 years.
And people need livable wages, right? I mean, the affordable housing problem is as much a problem of income as it is a problem of cost. And all these subsidies bridge that gap between income and cost. And all of these things we're talking about with density and design, permanently affordable, resale restricted housing, community land trust, they address the problem of cost. But that doesn't touch the problem of income. And if people don't have good jobs, secure jobs, adequate income, you still can never get enough money to close that gap between cost and income.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, a key part of this.
And that's actually one reason that I think the dynamic we're all talking about here is so important. The whole vibrant communities concept is that really when we're talking about creating opportunities for people of lower incomes to be able to afford housing, both workforce and in terms of being closer to services, more affordable transportation, you're also creating a dynamic that can actually create more jobs, because there are people who are business owners who talk about it's hard to find workers because they come to Vermont, they look at are they living in Vermont, and they need to live closer to the job. They can't find housing they can afford. So it's really it's a holistic thing. It's a synthesis between jobs, the kind of design of communities that we want and need if we really think it through, like we're trying to do here tonight.
That was a long answer.
Short question, long answer. Be careful what you ask.
Any other questions? Comments? Yes.
I just wondered, you were saying earlier that people seem to be kind of just opposed to this idea of density almost inherently. And I wonder if you have any other experience working in other states where maybe people think about that differently, just because I think a lot of people choose to retire to Vermont or move to Vermont or get a vacation house in Vermont or kind of migrate here for XYZ reason because they have this view of the rural, like you mentioned, the idyllic field and the mountain. And I wonder just what you would say to those people about why density is necessary and how there needs to be this shift in how we think of communities.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And it's been true for a long time, that people move here because they have an image in their mind of what living in Vermont is. It's a certain lifestyle. It's being far away from everyone in a beautiful natural environment. And in fact, many people buy that place when they move here, and then their lives change. They have children or they get older and they find that that's not ideal anymore. And it's when they want to move to the next phase, live in town, it becomes more difficult to find that that type of housing, because we have a shortage of that. The problem is that the existing communities have been slow to embrace the change themselves, to allow more housing units in their neighborhood or more building in their downtown, because they've got some older regulations that prevent it, that require large lots or prevent buildings over a certain height. So that keeps it from happening. And I think partly it's because they're not really sure how it could be a good change, how it could be a positive change. They haven't been shown that it could enhance the neighborhood, that bringing people more neighbors in will help create the possibility that there's a corner store. Someone has not made a solid case for that. Or it could just come down to fear of anything changing. And that's true all across the country, and I think it might be true all over the world, because people probably have an innate fear of change. But you overcome that by getting a few first good projects built. And then they can look at it and say, oh yeah, that's pretty nice. You know, we want something like that. That's how communities that have succeeded in this effort have really kind of gotten a few in to show people what it could be like, and then there's much less of a fear of change the next time around.
And in your travels, have you encountered some cities, some areas that have a different ethos, have a different approach to density?
I usually get called in because it's a big problem and they need people to sort of make a case for density. But if you look at a place that already has existing density, like Boston, New York, Chicago, Washington, and there's just plenty of examples around, and there's a great transit system in place, and people are kind of living their life that way. The urban lifestyle is not only familiar, it's incredibly attractive. So that more of that kind of development is really attractive. Washington, D.C. has been fantastic at extending their public transit system and then building dense housing around the train stations and the metro stations. So they get this great lifestyle that they can offer people of leaving your car behind and walking everywhere. And it's because they tied those two things together. So we're gonna have a train station here, and we're gonna allow high density, multi-story buildings around it, lots of stores, lots of office buildings, and we're not gonna require people to put in lots of parking spaces. So they didn't have as much fear of density, and as a result, they've come up with some great urban places that a lot of people are moving to. In fact, Arlington, Virginia, just outside of Washington, has the highest percentage of 20-somethings of any city in the country. And they're finding that as that age group ages into their 30s, they're starting to have families and the kids are going to school. They're actually not moving out to the suburbs because that kind of environment is so attractive to them. So there you go. There's your good example. And you know, I'm sure there's smaller city examples of it. It's just much harder to build the transit system and the density and lower the parking regulations at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
Being someone who likes to get the last word in, I see they're turning the lights off, so so
They're
we're going to
walking
have
us
to leave. But I
into the
wanted to say
library.
just one last thing, and that is that, you know, in terms of the idyllic Vermont, if we want to keep the kind of Vermont that people want to come to, both to live and stay or come as tourists, we need to not have little single-family houses scattered all over creation. We need to have density of housing in villages, and then we need to have the open space out around the rest of the state. And so the combination of them will be the best ultimately for everybody and nature too. So thank you all very much for coming out, and really appreciate the participation.
Thank you.